Today I'd like to talk to you about biased versus non-biased sampling and observational versus experimental. So we're first going to look at what does sampling even mean. So sampling means that we are going to collect data from an event. And if it is biased, that means it shows favorism. We want our samples to be unbiased. So we want them to be a good sample which represents an entire population without favoritism. So some kinds of samples that would show favoritism are, first of all, a convenience sample. That means I am just choosing people in a convenient manner to me as the data collector. For example, if I'm going to just choose people from my class, I'll just choose the first 5 names on my roster list. That is convenient to me. So that is called a convenience sample, which means it is biased. The next bias sampling is that which is called voluntary response sampling. It's where the researcher appeals to only people who volunteer to take the survey. So an example of that would be like on American Idol when you vote. It is only people who watch American Idol that choose to vote. So it is not a representative of the entire population. It is a representative of those who have favoritism to American Idol. The next kind of bias sampling is called non-responsive bias. This means that people are chosen unwillingly or they're unable to participate. So people are chosen unwillingly or are unable to participate. An example of this would be like your mail-in surveys. So you can elect to not answer the survey. And lots of times even we can change that to not only mail-in, but email surveys, where we can elect to not answer a survey because it's just been emailed to us and we can choose to not do it. That would be non-responsive bias. And then our last kind of bias is called a lack of blinding. So it is, an example is, if 2 drugs are being compared, one can sometimes be introduced to the human beings involved despite the best effort to be objective and unbiased. So if you have a lack of blinding, it means that you know which patients are in the control group and which patients are taking the placebo. It's you're not blinded to it. So it's like those who are taking the survey, are doing the test, are not blinded. They know if they're in the drug group or the placebo group. Or like I think of the Coke versus Pepsi challenge. When the people taking the challenge know which cup holds Coke and which cup holds Pepsi, they are not blinded to the test. They are knowing. So there is a lack of blindness. Also, oftentimes telephone surveys are called market surveys, are considered biased. There again, it would be a convenience. They're calling their people at convenience. Okay, let's try a few examples. The athletic director wants to know what is WFHS students' favorite extracurricular activity. So the sample is chosen from people attending a theater production. Is this a biased or unbiased sampling? We would say it is biased because they only sampled theater people. They did not sample every extracurricular activity and get a response. Next one. A local radio station wants to know if the patron's favorite airtime is. They ask patrons to call in and report it. Is that biased or unbiased? That is also biased because that is one of those voluntary response biases. Only the people who want to respond will call in. The prom committee wants to select a favorite color theme. They ask 40 students from the enrollment roster their opinion. Is that a biased or unbiased sample? That would be unbiased because they randomly selected 40 people off of the roster, not in any order. All right, now let's look at experimental versus observational. For something to be an experiment, it is when you assign people or things to groups. You have one group that would receive the treatment and one group that is called the control group that do not receive the treatment. When you have an experimental, you are looking as the data collector for a change or an effect on people or the things that happen. An example would be you're testing out a new drug, so you have a placebo drug that you're testing. Like over at Prax Institute, they would do this. Versus when something is an observational study, that's where we just take a measurement without trying to affect some change on the participants. You just stand there and observe what is happening. An example of this would be counting the number of cars that pass by a certain area and what color each kind of car is. You're simply counting. So observational means you are counting or tallying. Where experimental means you would place people into groups. Now, why would we do observational studies? Well, if we needed to answer a question associated with measurement, where we just simply are seeing how long something takes or what is the best. You're providing information about relations amongst the variables, so what's your favorite color? You're documenting information for future use, or you describe any changes found in a sequence of surveys where you're looking for a change from this year to next year. So you're simply observing the answers when you're comparing different variables. Whereas you would use an experimental study to study specific factors to determine consequences of different treatments or to determine cause of your variables. Why did this occur? So now let's look at some questions as to whether this is an experiment or an observational study. So if I am planning on studying the effect of a calcium supplement on young girls' bone mass, would I conduct an experimental study or an observational study? An experiment, because I would divide my candidates into groups. One group that had the calcium supplement and one group that did not. Okay, second situation. I'm going to study the amount of time college students taking a full course load spend watching TV. Would you run an experiment or would you run an observation? That would be observational, because you would simply ask people what their course load is and how much time they spend TV. So you're simply counting up the number of people who watch their TV. Third, study of popularity of Crocs amongst West Fargo High School. Would you run an experiment or would you simply observe? That again would be observational. I would just watch and count how many are wearing Crocs. The fourth one, I'm going to study the effect of eating breakfast on a GPA. Would you run an experiment or an observational? Now, I've had people argue for both. They said if I run an experiment, I would divide my candidates into two groups. A group who eats breakfast and a group that does not eat breakfast, and ask them their GPAs. Then others said they would purely do it by observational. They would just ask students, do you eat breakfast and what's your GPA? The last one, I'm going to study the effect of traffic on our local street. Would you run an experiment or an observation? That again would be observational. I would just go out and count the number of cars that pass by my street. That would be difficult to divide the cars into two groups. Groups that are not on your street and groups that are on your street. So observational would be the best there. All right, so now you should be able to answer the couple of worksheets that there are on whether an experiment is needed or an observational study would be best. You should also be able to answer questions on whether the sampling was done randomly enough that it was not biased or unbiased.